Okay, this section should actually be pretty short, pretty straightforward. Most of these are, again, concepts that you actually use all the time. You just don't necessarily analyze them or think of them. And this is basically the whole idea of how we move on the landscape, which also, of course, is our perception of the landscape. And you can see this between the difference between the first, which is absolute distance, and the idea of relative distance. If you've been here for any length of time or born and raised here, especially if you're born here in the Honolulu side, the idea of Honolulu to Waipahu is quite short. On the mainland, my relatives think nothing of driving 200 miles, and one of my cousins used to drive 120 miles to get to work every morning, so he was 250 miles a day in LA, not surprisingly. So, absolute distance and location was the time it took and the distance he had to go was just, I just didn't think about it. I don't think. Of course, it helped you as a long distance truck driver too, so you did nothing but drive. But the idea of absolute distance, the idea of how far you're going, is on the mainland oftentimes, compared to here, is seen in a very different way. And distances here that are considered pretty big on the mainland, to be honest, I don't know that my relatives don't even think about it. So absolute distance and location is one thing. Now, of course, you also have to factor in other technical aspects. For example, absolute distance and location, if you're going by car in gridlock, is different than, for example, if I'm in someplace like Tokyo and I'm going on their superb subway system where you jump on a tram that comes by every 5 minutes, leaves exactly on time, gets to the next station exactly on time. So in 15, 20 minutes, you've moved halfway across the city. That's a very different view of how that plays out. So absolute distance and location, there are sort of factors that mitigate that or sort of modify it a little bit. But in general, absolute distance and location is of course, again, what one of the purposes of maps is very easily to do absolute distance. Of course, you go to Google Earth or Google Maps, you can actually, one of the options is actually click locations. It'll tell you, you can actually do a path. It'll tell you exactly how far it is. And in some cases, if it's the mainland, it'll actually tell you, estimated time it's going to take. And you probably use something like Google Maps for driving, where it actually tells you where to turn, how far, etc. That's all absolute distance and location. And this is all tied into a very complex system of satellites and what we call GPS systems here in the United States. So there's different systems in China, and the Europeans have their own, et cetera, Russians do. But they'll do the same thing. They use a set of satellites, and of course your phones have this information on them. If your phone is on, it's almost invariably its GPS is turned on all the time. And so you actually have the ability, or whether it's intrusive or not only do you know where you are, but theoretically anyone who has access to information knows where you are, or more accurately knows where your phone is. And we use this in a whole mess of different ways that you're probably very familiar with. These are all absolute distances. Now, the next concept is a little different, but they're not really totally different. They're related. And there's the idea of relative distance and location. Again, if you've lived here a long time, the idea of going out to Waipahu, for example, is just seems like a long drive. In terms of time, it actually is a pretty long drive, relatively speaking, especially for here. By the mainland standards, if you say, I got to go 15, 20 miles to get to Waipahu, I was like, yeah. To them, that's like, you just do that. The idea of going 15, 20 miles to go to a Target or a Walmart, for my relatives, it doesn't even occur to them to be an issue. To go 15 miles, 20 miles to go get dinner just seems like a normal state of affairs. So, the idea of relative distance varies tremendously. On an island like ours, it's very congested. It's also relatively small. Relative distance changes. In some ways, we become much like what you see in Japan, where things become more insular, more compacted down. So going from, say, Palolo here to, Aiea is a trip. It's a journey. But on the mainland, that would just, for many areas, people wouldn't even particularly think about it. So relative distance location is people's perception of not only how far they're going or whether that's a journey or not, or what type of journey or trip it is, but also there's perceptions of relative location, in the sense of their perception of what the places they're going to. So, for example, for different parts of the island of Oahu, or different parts of Honolulu, the idea of Waikiki is very different. It's the same place, in the sense of it's on the map in the same location, but what people see it as, how they view it as, its function And for example, if you're from the outer islands, from Maui, for example, then Waikiki is in many ways a somewhat different commodity to someone who's born and raised, say, in Manoa. So, locations are relative locations are very complicated in terms of effort, value. Is it worth going to that location? What are you going to find at that location? Which really doesn't have a lot to do with the description of it. You think of, for example, here on this part of Oahu, Ala Moana Center is sort of, obviously the main retail hub, ex-COVID. And so, but people would go to Ala Moana Center to go shopping. Other people just go there to kill time. Other people go there because it's Saturday, they want to check out everyone else. So even though it's the same thing, it's the same distance, it's the same description, the number of stores, etc., people's perception of it and what function it serves to them and why they're going to go there or not varies tremendously. And geographers oftentimes are seen as the people that do the absolute distance and location, and we do. But most geographers, especially human geographers, are much more interested in relative distance and location. How does your perception shape the choices you make? And that goes back to that time space thing I was talking about how restaurants work. The choices you make in terms of where you're going to go, how you're going to get there, why you're going there. And why is it important to go to this place, but you don't see that other location as being of value? Intervening opportunity is a concept that you see a lot when you're looking at things like economics. And this basically just sort of plays out to the fact that if you've got, well, actually a good example here would be if you're Japanese tour company, post-COVID, Hawaii is a very attractive tourist destination. So if you figure you're coming from, say, Osaka, that'd be A, and you're going to go to Hawaii, and that's B. So that's a travel, that's a tourist destination. On the other hand, what you find is Guam, for example, to the west of us, then Okinawa to the south of Osaka, have set them up as counterpoints to Hawaii. If you want the Hawaii experience without the hassle of going to Hawaii, without the cost of going to Hawaii, then Guam and Okinawa are both presented as cheaper alternatives to Hawaii, but in many ways they package themselves as Hawaii. So they don't package themselves as come to Okinawa to experience Okinawa, well, they know very much. And they don't package Guam, come to Micronesia and experience Guam. They package themselves as basically a Hawaii surrogate. And this becomes what we call an intervening opportunity, because if you're a Japanese travel company and you want to do budget travel, for example, so you want to do budget tour groups, then, packaging tour groups to Guam, you can tell people, well, yeah, you can go to Hawaii, but it's really crowded. There's a lot of, other folks there, and, it's really expensive. If you go to Guam, it's only going to cost you half as much. You'll have a nicer time. The beaches are more empty, bum, 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 bum. And so that becomes what we call an intervening opportunity. So whereas you had, say, Osaka here and Hawaii here, now someone's positioned themselves as an alternative. And then to a certain extent, if they're successful, they're going to siphon off part of what would have come to Hawaii is now going to go to Guam or go to Okinawa or someplace else. If you're familiar with tourist gambling here in Hawaii and where they go, Boyd Group runs most of it, which is Vacations Hawaii here. And they run a bunch of casinos in Vegas, but they also offer cheaper alternatives like Henderson, Nevada, which is right next to Vegas. And Henderson basically exists because it's a cheaper alternative to Vegas. If you don't want to stay on the strip, you don't want to pay for it, but you still want to gamble, go here. And there's a whole mess of other locations in Nevada and on the California border that basically are intervening opportunities. So it means exactly what it says. Intervene means to intervene or to get in the middle of existing patterns. And not surprisingly, if you're someplace that's something mildly successful, there's someplace around you that's wildly successful, positioning yourself to take a cut of that pie is a real logical way to increase your viability economically, socially, tourism, whatever it might be. So intervening opportunity is usually seen in economic systems, especially in tourism, but also in other things like, production, for example, making things. So again, pretty straightforward. And again, the terms pretty much, are self-explanatory in some ways. Distance decay is actually, and distance decay and friction of distance both are very, very much with us in 2021. However, the confusion we have in 2021 is the fact that with the internet, and especially portable communications like smartphones and everything like that, there's a tendency to think that distance doesn't matter anymore. Now, this is exacerbated by, if you're like me and you're an Amazon Prime member, the fact that you can order almost anything, a large chunk of what's on the planet, and it seems absolutely painless. But you realize that if you order something that's from here in Honolulu on Amazon, it's going to get here a lot faster than if you order something that's, say, from England, that's going to get here on Amazon. That's distance decay. Distance invariably has added cost to it in one way, shape, or form. Now, it doesn't look like it on your smartphone. You know, you can call anyone in the world in 2021 on your phone. But the reality is your phone plan, what you're paying on a monthly basis, has that built in. So what they've done is they've hidden the distance cost. And in doing so, make it seem like it isn't there. So it's sort of like a shell game. Distance is still a factor. And the further things are away, the more either technology or cost of shipping or whatever are going to come into play. So distance makes things more expensive. Clarity tends to disappear with distance and becomes harder to transmit things in the modern terms. Your chance of digital fallout increases with distance. So distance decay is still with us. And if you want to think of that in a spectacular way, think of how much it costs to put a satellite up that's part of our, smartphone telecommunication systems, like say Verizon or someone's using. And they don't actually own the satellites. Most of the satellites are owned by companies that do nothing but put those satellites in orbit so that you can use them for cell phone communication. So distance decay is still there. It's just our technology tends to make it, like many things in our lives, tends to make it look like it's not there. But that's very much almost like a CGI. It actually is there. Friction of distance is very straightforward. This basically means that, again, it's a variation of some of the same thing. When things are further away, cost intervene. If it's further away, the cost of the thing will go up, regardless of whether it's digital or physical. The time it takes will change. The value in terms of what it's worth individually will change. The effort that it takes to ship it changes. So there's a whole mess of things that change when distance occurs. And again, we tend to not think about that too much till, here in Hawaii, if you use something like Amazon, it's pretty obvious because it just takes longer for stuff to get here. If you ordered your textbooks, it's probably taking you a while to get them if you ordered them late. Well, that's friction of distance. We tend to sort of build it into our lives. So I think in many ways we don't see it. Of course, we have the false assumption that the distance isn't an issue in 2021, but it very much still is. It's just sort of hidden in that regard. So when you look at this whole sort of moving on landscapes, distance and movement, it's important to remember that despite the technology in this period of time, all of these factors still play out in really not very different ways. There are the cost, for example, you incur in all sorts of not too subtle ways, and in some ways pretty subtle ways, to make it look like there isn't any distance impact, but it does.